Good evening. Got to get all these little gadgets figured out before I can get started. It's a little new to me. See how it goes. Glad to be up here. Glad to have the opportunity to speak to you tonight. What we'll be talking about, as you can see by the title, is handling Satan. I think this is an important topic, and it's discussed bit by bit, but I'd like to look at it in detail tonight. Satan is one of those things that he's easy to forget about because we don't see him. He's not standing over our shoulder. Same thing with Jesus. It's often easy to forget that we have something we ought to be doing just because Jesus isn't actually standing next to us, even though we know he's there. So what I'd like to do tonight, the purpose of this lesson is to learn how to identify Satan, to look at some examples of Satan at work, and to examine 3 specific methods of handling Satan in our day-to-day life. Because, again, we don't always see him. So, for that first one, let's go ahead and look at some ways that we can identify Satan. In Genesis chapter 3, and looking at verse 1, "Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, God has said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden." Okay, so here we see that Satan is in the form of a serpent. If you will, turn to 1 Peter and chapter 5. Look at verse 8. This is a familiar passage to us. "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walks about, seeking whom he may devour." So by these passages, we can see that we should beware the zoo, because there are serpents and lions are in abundance, right? No, as I said before, Satan isn't always so obvious. He's not so... Sometimes he is. We'll look at a few instances where he is, but he's not always just in your face, "I'm Satan, here I am, obey me." So what I want us to see tonight is that sometimes Satan is seen in the faces of strangers, and we'll look at examples of all of these. Sometimes when in our day-to-day life, I've had times that I've been invited to someone's house, someone that I knew, and one of their friends happens to show up while I'm there, and they offer me a beer. Now, that's not really a particular temptation to me, but for some people it is. And so, what do we do when we see Satan in the faces of strangers? Sometimes we have to identify what's going on, who's really doing the talking. Sometimes he's seen in the faces of friends. Shortly after I got my driver's license, I did a lot of driving friends around. And one of the things that I tried to do sometimes was do the speed limit and set a good example. And I remember one time that I had 2 people in my back seat and a person up front, good friends of mine, and I'm driving along. I'm in the right lane of the freeway. I'm doing 65. I'm trying to set a good example. And the guy sitting next to me is kind of looking there, and every now and then he looks over at my speedometer. Finally he says, "Can't this thing go any faster?" And I stepped on it. That is a temptation to me. That was something that I was already trying, and Satan knew how to get to me through my friends. "Hey, can't this thing go any faster?" And so this is why it's important to learn how to recognize who's really doing the talking. I see my buddy sitting there. That's who's sitting there. But the words that are coming out of his mouth are straight from the devil, because it's leading me into temptation and leading me into sin. We also see Satan in the faces of our family members. This is a really tough one. This is even more tough to deal with than our friends, oftentimes, because our family is much closer. And I know I've mentioned this to you before, but when I was a kid, we'd have family visit us, or we'd go visit family, and they traveled a long distance. We'd go from Colorado to Arkansas, or even from California to Arkansas, or Washington to Arkansas. Most of my mother's side of the family was in Arkansas. So we're traveling to Arkansas to see relatives, and then when we get there, we go to church. And they say, "Well, you came all this way. You could have gone to church in Washington, or you could have gone to church in Colorado. You came all this way to see us, and now you're going to church? Well, yeah. And it took a long time. At the time, I was a kid, and I didn't really recognize at the time the importance of the example that my parents set by saying, yeah, we are going to church, and you're welcome to join us. As a kid, I didn't see the example. I was looking at, well, I got all these relatives. I got kids my age, relatives, that I hardly ever see. I'm with them. We came all this way to go to church. We could have done that in Colorado or Washington. So, as a kid, I didn't recognize that. But it was Satan at work through our family. And the same thing happened when they came to visit us. Well, we came all this way was the common excuse. We came all this way. Yeah, and you're welcome to join us a little bit further down the road to church. But over the years, family got over that. And they knew that when we traveled to visit them, we were going to be in church on Sundays and Wednesdays. And they knew that if they came to visit us, they could make themselves at home in our house, or they could come with us. But the hardest one, I think, often, is sometimes we can see Satan in our own selfish thoughts. Now, I put this word up here, selfish, for a reason. Because the root cause of sin is always selfishness. It's easy to overlook that, but it's true. The root cause of any sin we are ever tempted to do is selfishness. When my buddy said, can't this thing go any faster, and I stepped on it, that was out of selfishness that I stepped on it. The truth is, I wanted to go faster, and I was holding myself back just barely with a little bit of self-control, and all it took was a word to set me off, and okay, here we go. Let's see what this hunk of junk can do. So, plus, if we look at James, we don't have time to turn there tonight, but James chapter 1, verses 14 and 15 tell us that sin comes about after we lust for something. We lust for it, and then we sin, and death is the result. So, it's important to realize that when we have these selfish thoughts urging us to go faster, simple example, or take an alcoholic beverage, the root cause is selfishness. I really want to do it. And it doesn't matter what God has to say about it, I wanted to do it. So, let's look at some examples in the scriptures of Satan at work. In 1 Kings chapter 13, this is a familiar passage to us, 1 Kings chapter 13, and we'll read verses 7 through 11, and then we'll skip down to 18 and 19. But to kind of bring us up to speed on what's going on, a prophet who's only given the only title we know him by is man of God. We don't get a name for him. This man of God comes to pronounce judgment on Jeroboam, and after he puts the king in his place and lets him know that God had sent him, then in verse 7 says, "And the king said to the man of God, 'Come home with me and refresh yourself, and I will give you a reward.' And the man of God said unto the king, 'If you will give me half your house, I will not go in with you. Neither will I eat bread or drink water in this place, because so it was charged to me by the word of the Lord, saying, Eat no bread, nor drink water, nor turn again by the same way that you came.' So he went another way, and returned not by the way he came to Bethel. Now there dwelt an old prophet in Bethel, and his sons came and told him all the works the man of God had done that day in Bethel. The words which he had spoken unto the king, they also told to their father." So then skipping down to verse 18, the old prophet that was just talked to by his sons tracked down the man of God and followed him, and picking up in verse 18, "And he said to him, I am a prophet also as you are. And an angel spoke to me by the word of the Lord, saying, Bring him back with you into your house, that he may eat bread and drink water. But he lied to him. So he went back with him, and he ate bread in his house and drank water." And we all know what came next is the old prophet pronounced judgment on him because he disobeyed the word of the Lord. This was a complete stranger. For whatever reason, the stranger came to talk to the man of God. The man of God knew what he was supposed to do. He told the king, and when this prophet tracked him down, he told this prophet too. And then the prophet lied to him and said, but wait, I'm different. An angel came to me and told me that it was okay for you to come back. Now, what we're doing right now is really in process and in practice identifying Satan at work. The scriptures don't come right out and say this man was speaking the words of Satan. But we can see from the text who's doing the work of Satan. Here this prophet, the older prophet, caused the death of the younger prophet by tempting him and enticing him back to eat bread and drink water. Satan was at work in this older prophet. Whether the scriptures come right out and say that Satan entered the man and caused him to do this, not important. We don't need it to do that for us in order for us to identify Satan at work. When we know the commands of God, that's the most important part. First, we have to know it. We can't obey it if we don't know it. If we know the commands of God and we don't do them because of something someone said or something someone did, then we're no different than this man of God. Twice we can read where he reported the words of the Lord to whoever he was talking to, first to the king, then to this old prophet, and yet he still disobeyed. And in 2 Samuel chapter 24, 2 Samuel 24 and just verses 1 to 4, all these passages should be familiar to us, really. Here, this is commonly called David numbering the people, or sin of David. There's different headings in your Bibles if you have any headings at all. But beginning in verse 24, it says, again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, go number Israel and Judah. For the king said to Joab, the captain of the host which was with him, go now through all the tribes of Israel, from Dan even to Beersheba, and number the people, that I may know the number of the people. And Joab said to the king, now the Lord your God add unto the people, however many there be, 100-fold, and that the eyes of my lord the king may see it. But why does my lord the king delight in this thing? Notwithstanding, the king's word prevailed against Joab, and against the captains of the host, and Joab and the captains of the host went out from the presence of the king to number the people of Israel. Now, we can see the folly in this from the response of Joab. What's wrong, we might ask, with numbering the people? What's wrong with wanting to know how many people there are? But we see from Joab's answer. Look again at Joab's response in verse 3. Joab said to the king, now the Lord your God add to the people, however many there be, 100-fold. David wants to know what he's got in strength of numbers, what he has for battle. What is my fighting force? And Joab said, it doesn't matter how many there are in the army. God adds 100-fold. But David wanted to know how many. Does it matter how many when your army is with God at its side? What did Paul say? If God be with us, who can be against us, right? David had seen it with 600 men, his 600 mighty men. David conquered innumerable forces. So David didn't need to number the people. Joab gave the right answer, and apparently so did the captains, because in verse 4, it says that the word of the king prevailed against Joab and against the captains of the host. So all David's captains were saying, this isn't necessary. But David did it anyway, and what we can see here is Satan at work in David. And it didn't matter that his captains, his friends, and his trusted men said, it isn't necessary, this is folly. He did it anyway. Genesis chapter 19. If you'll turn over there. And we'll look at Satan at work in some family. Again, this is one that wouldn't really be a temptation to me, but apparently it was a temptation to the daughters of Lot. Lot went up out of Zoar, beginning in verse 30, and dwelt in the mountain, and his 2 daughters with him, for he feared to dwell in Zoar. and he dwelt in a cave, he and his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come in to us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he perceived not when she laid down, nor when she arose. And it came to pass on the morrow that the firstborn said to the younger, Behold, I lay last night with my father, let us make him drink wine also this night, and you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve the seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. Thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father. So we can read of incest. Now, the older sister comes and says, let's do this thing, and we don't read what the younger sister's response is. It's not recorded for us. My response would have been icky, but that wasn't the response. They knew what was right, but they didn't do it. So again, Satan prevailed by approaching through a family member. And in Numbers chapter 20, I want to spend a little bit more time on this one than we did the others. Numbers chapter 20, and really kind of set it up. As a kid, my dad would always say, Moses got kept from the promised land because he struck a rock. How many of you heard that? My dad was always saying that. Hey, anytime you say how insignificant a sin might be, a little white lie. Hey, Moses got kept out of the promised land because he struck a rock, right? Well, it's true, he did strike a rock, and it's true that in verse 8, God did give him the commandment to speak to the rock. So did he break the command? Sure he did. But what does the text say that kept him out of the promised land? So I want to examine this a little bit closer because I think it's worse than he struck a rock. If we look in verses 2 and 3, well really 2 through 4, the people rise up and they start complaining and they turn against Moses and Aaron and they want to return to Egypt. And in verse 6, God separates Moses and Aaron from the people inside the tabernacle. Moses and Aaron are brought into the tabernacle, God closes the door, and God surrounds the tabernacle. The people have no idea what's being said to Moses. We'll see why that's important in just a minute. In verse 8, God instructs Moses and Aaron what they're to do. Go and speak to the rock. And then in verse 12, after Moses does what he does, I want to read that one real quick. Verse 12 of Numbers chapter 20 says, And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, Because you did not believe me, to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this congregation into the land I have given them. So here's the charge. This is what God is, what would you call that? Indicting them for. This is the charge, the indictment. That when they did what they did, the people saw Moses and Aaron dishonor God, right? That's the statement. Now, did the people know Moses was supposed to speak to the rock? No, because in verse 6, God separated them, locking them into the tabernacle. God gave them the commandments in secret, and then they went out to the congregation. So only they knew that they were supposed to speak to it. Did they break the command? Sure they did. They struck the rock, but that's not the point. Look at what God had said. When you did what you did, the people saw you dishonor me. Does striking the rock fit that description? No. So let's begin in verse 10 and see what it was they did. Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation together before the rock, and he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beasts also. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, Because you did not believe me, to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. Must we bring water from this rock? You hear that? Who's the we? Moses and Aaron? Maybe Moses, Aaron, and God? Who's the we? Must we bring water from the rock? This transgression is not so simple as just striking a rock. This is almost as bad as what caused Herod to be eaten by worms. Moses is taking the credit from God. And this is what fits the charge in verse 12. When you did what you did, the people saw you dishonor me. Right? Must we bring water from this rock? Must we? And Aaron didn't correct him. Now, we find sometimes it's hard to tell who's actually doing the talking when we're dealing with Moses and Aaron, because Moses told God one of his excuses was, I'm not very good with dealing with people. I'm not a good speaker. And God said, that's okay. I'll send you your brother, and he'll do the talking for you. So a lot of times when we read in the Exodus, as Moses is before Pharaoh, it says Moses and Aaron said, and Moses said. So it's difficult to tell if this is Aaron doing the speaking, or this is Moses doing the speaking, or if they're both speaking together in tandem. I don't know. But either way, whichever one of them was doing the speaking, the other should have corrected. Otherwise, he shares in the sin. So this is, in some ways, it's more simple than being kept from the promised land because he struck a rock. All it was a two-letter word. Substitute the we with God, and you got it. Hear now, you rebels, listen up, you rebellious people. Must God bring water from this rock? Would there have been a problem there? He still struck the rock instead of speaking to it like he was told to. But the indictment was, when you did what you did, the people saw you dishonor me. Striking the rock just doesn't fit. This came, though, from Moses' struggle with Satan. This came from his own problems. At this point in time, he's put up with these stiff-necked, rebellious people for almost 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. He was close to the end of the wandering when he made this mistake and was kept from the promised land after all that work. Here's Moses at the end of his rope. He's angry. These people, of all people in the world, should know that God has not abandoned them. He's not going to let them die of thirst in the wilderness. But he let his temper get the better of him. Whatever the case, instead of saying, let God bring forth water from the rock, he said, must I and my brother bring you water from the rock? So let's look at some ways that we are told to handle Satan, to deal with him when we see him in our lives. One of the ways, in Genesis chapter 9, again, these aren't just blurted out for us. We have to see it. We have to examine the text a little bit to see what we ought to be doing. When in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 20, we'll read through verse 23. It says, And Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine, and he was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment, and laid it upon both their shoulders, and went backward, and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backward, that they did not see their father's nakedness. So I labeled this gentle correction. We can call it whatever we want. But they saw the need, they saw the problem, and we don't read about Shem and Japheth rebuking Ham. Noah did that when he got up and found out what had happened. But at the time, it was gentle correction. He came and he told them, ha, very funny, Dad's naked in his tent, and they covered him up. So they fixed the problem gently. Matthew chapter 4, I just want to look at the verses where Jesus responds. Satan comes to Jesus directly. Here's where he is rather obvious. And he comes to Jesus, and Each time that Satan brings a temptation to Jesus, 3 times we can read about it. In verse 4, in verse 7, and verse 10, we'll go ahead and read those. But he answered and said, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God." In verse 7, but Jesus said to him, "It is written again, you shall not tempt the Lord your God." In verse 10, then said Jesus unto him, "Get hence, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve." So all 3 times that Satan approached Jesus, Jesus responded, "It is written." So again, we have to know the word. We have to know the direction that we're supposed to take in order for us to make the proper response. And lastly, in Matthew 16, and beginning in verse 21. From that time forth, Jesus began to show unto his disciples how that he must go into Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised again the 3rd day. Then Peter took him and began to rebuke him, saying, "Be it far from you, Lord, this shall not be done to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, you are an offense to me, for you savor not the things that are of God, but the things that are of men." I called this return fire. Sometimes when the enemy attacks, you return fire. Now, unfortunately, there's no code book to tell us which one to use for what situation, right? Because if it was always the right answer to give gentle correction, Jesus wouldn't have returned fire. If it was always the right answer, for it is written, then we wouldn't have seen Jesus use the gentle correction in John 4, speaking to the woman at the well, right? So if it's always the answer to do one of these, then that would always be the answer that we see. But we read of different responses dealing with different people and different situations. So again, unfortunately, we don't have a step-by-step instruction manual telling us, for this situation, use this response. That's for us to determine. And that burden falls on us to judge wisely. That's the key. Judge wisely. Sometimes we'll make the mistake and we'll use gentle correction when we should have returned fire, and vice versa. And sometimes we'll use it as written when the person you're talking to has no idea what the Bible even is and doesn't care what's written. Sometimes you have to use a different response depending on the individual. But in conclusion, Satan may not appear to us as a serpent or a lion or a dragon as we see him depicted in Revelation. He's not always so obvious, but he is no less dangerous. In fact, as we've seen, sometimes he's more dangerous when he's working through friends and family and in your own head than he is when he's working through, if he's a lion or a big dragon lands in front of you, not listening to you, I'll look at one example of the blatantly obvious in Acts chapter 14. Here we see the dragon just leap out in front of somebody, and we see their response. Beginning in verse 11, we'll read through 14. This is when Paul and Barnabas are in Lystra, and beginning in verse 14, I'm going to have to back up just a little bit. Beginning in verse 11. When the people saw that what Paul had done, they just healed a man who had been lame from birth. When the people saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in the speech of Lycaonia, "The gods are come down to us in the likeness of men." And they called Barnabas Jupiter, and Paul Mercurius, because he was the chief speaker. Then the priests of Jupiter, which was before their city, brought oxen and garlands unto the gates, and would have done sacrifice with the people, which when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of, they rent their clothes and ran among the people, crying out. And as we can read, they narrowly avoided having sacrifices offered to them. So sometimes Satan is obvious. He tries a little bit of everything. As we read in Genesis 3:1, he's the most subtle or most crafty of the creatures. So he'll try a little bit of everything. If he didn't get you with one thing, he'll try something else. If the subtle working through a friend was avoided and you kept to your guns and you did what you were supposed to, he'll try a family member. If that doesn't work, he'll just leap out in front of you, like the roaring lion or the dragon. So sometimes Satan is obvious, but it's not always that way. Sometimes it takes work, it takes effort, and it takes a constant vigil to recognize him trying to work in our lives. Back to 1 Peter, we kind of opened on this note, and I'd like to close on this note as well. In 1 Peter chapter 5, and we'll just begin in verse 6 and read down to verse 11, because this gives the answer for how to handle Satan in your lives. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, because he cares for you. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walks about seeking whom he may devour, whom resist steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same afflictions are accomplished in your brethren that are in the world. But the God of all grace, who has called us unto his eternal glory by Jesus Christ, after that you have suffered a while, make you perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. To him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. One of the biggest mistakes that we can make in trying to deal with Satan or handling Satan is trying to do it by ourselves. We don't have the strength. The strength is not in us. If it was, Adam and Eve never would have eaten that fruit to begin with. They would have left that tree alone, built a hedge around it, or cut it down and burned it, because that wasn't commanded against. You just said, don't eat it. So, it didn't work. The gentle correction, the it is written, the return fire can all be summed up in the word resist. Here Peter says, resist him steadfast, and he will flee from you. But we do that through Jesus Christ. We do that with the help of God. He begins the whole segment here by saying, humble yourselves before God, and he will exalt you in due time. We don't use our own strength to do battle with Satan. We're not big enough. We're not strong enough. We use God, because no matter how many people there are, he adds 100-fold, right? So if you have any need at this time, if you found that you've succumbed to Satan in your daily life, there's no shame in that. It happens. The shame is in staying in the muck and not getting back on your feet and marching forward. That's what we have to do when we fall. If there's anyone here who has need of the prayers of the church or the waters of baptism, let that need be known as we stand and as we sing the song that's been selected.